Chapter 18. 12 days before I turned 30, I still hadn't figured out what I would do to celebrate the occasion. In many ways, I was busting to get out of my 20s. They had been full on, and I was so keen to start a much quieter decade. 6 months of grieving the loss of my dreams to have a large family had made way for some positive anticipation for this next chapter in my life. What would it look like for Veronica, the career woman? It felt so foreign, yet I knew that I had something to offer as a counselor, and I was excited about being able to contribute on a bigger scale and to more than just my town and friends, just my home and friends. It was October 17th, 2004, a Sunday evening, and I was feeling restless. I realized that I didn't want to have to stay at home as I normally did, and I could pop out, and Abigail, my sister, could look after Asher and Tikva for a while. This was new to me. I was so used to doing everything with them. I explained that I needed some space, and without really having a plan, I just walked down our driveway to the church on the same property. I didn't normally go to the evening service. In fact, even the morning service was becoming more and more rare with me, finding it so hard to ignore the inconsistencies in the church. I sat down in the closest empty seat and tried to focus on the sermon. A young guy was preaching, and he was very earnest. I thought back to a time in my life when it could have been me up there. My world had been so black and white, and I had all the answers. It was hard to pinpoint when exactly things had started to unravel for me. Obviously, living with a preacher who was so gifted when it came to speaking about the Bible, but then a complete asshole at home, was an easy place to start. But I knew it went further than that. Studying theology in Sydney and realizing that I had more questions than answers hadn't helped, and that so much of the Bible is really just man-made. Someone's interpretation and not necessarily divinely inspired. The unraveling went further back, though, than that. For me, it had begun when I worked for those wealthy Jewish families in Jerusalem, and listening to them sing the Sabbath prayers and realizing that I wasn't any different. I was just as religious. This intimate relationship I claimed to have with Jesus was just wishful thinking. I had brainwashed myself to believe it by singing these songs about this supposed relationship that I was meant to be having, while in reality it was just a relationship I craved and longed for, but there was actually nothing there. Like the man I ended up marrying, Jesus, who was meant to be my divine lover, was actually just a typical male giving me the silent treatment. As the sermon came to a close, I noticed that a guy I had spoken to a couple of times was sitting just a few seats away from me. I was pretty sure his name was Andrew. A new friend of mine had a bit of a crush on him, and had told me that he had moved across from Melbourne and his mum was dying from cancer. He was into social justice, especially after a trip to India with one of the guys from our church. He came to talk to me as people started getting up from their seats and asked me if I felt uplifted by the sermon. I knew he was being sarcastic. Without missing a beat, I went into great details of how inspiring the sermon was and that it really made me see the error of my ways. The two of us were obviously on the same page when it came to the church. He went on to ask me how my kids were doing. I was impressed he remembered them from our very brief encounter months earlier. I tried to think back to how long it had been since I chatted to him and realized it was back in May, just about the time I had decided that my 30s would not have any boyfriends in it, so there was no point pursuing a guy who seemed somewhat intriguing. I told him that things were great with the kids and that we were having a wonderful time. My sister was now living with us and life was busy, but fun. Aren't you supposed to be bitter and angry? That's how single mothers are meant to be, no? I laughed. No, not me. I'm a happy single mom. He went on to say that he was so jealous of me and that he would love to be a dad. He had only recently convinced his boss to let him work part-time so he could have more time doing fun stuff. I obviously didn't give him the reaction that he wanted because he went on to explain that engineers never work part-time. They squeeze in as many work hours as they can each week. It was so unique to have the freedom to not work full-time. I told him he might be exactly what I've been searching for. He looked surprised and waited for me to continue. I explained that I needed a male in my life, a token male, someone who would come and hang out with my kids and do fun stuff, like take them on nature walks and bike rides and things that challenge them somewhat. There was way too much estrogen in the house with it just being me and my sister as adults. I needed some testosterone for my kids. His eyes lit up and he told me that he would love to do that with them and would love the opportunity to hang out with my kids. His friends were leaving church, so we quickly exchanged numbers. Instead of my name, I wrote Happy Single Mom next to my number. We organized for him to come over the following Thursday. I told him we live in the manse next door. Turned out he lived in a manse as well, the one down the road. The next day, I was lying on our trampoline, as I often did when I needed time to think. Looking up at the giant trees, I realized that I really didn't know much about Andrew at all, and here I was asking him to hang out with my kids. From our little encounter that night before, I realized that we would have lots to chat about, and I didn't really want Thursday to be just about the two of us offloading on each other about the state of the church. He was meant to be hanging out with the kids, not chatting to me. I really should meet with him first. As soon as I thought that, I quickly dismissed the idea. He would think I was romantically interested in him, and he would get the wrong idea. Normally, I would have left it at that. However, the past couple of days, Abigail and I had been talking about our internal voices. Those little voices that don't actually belong to us, but they sit in our mind and shoot down the ideas that we have. They are constantly sabotaging our true intentions. This was a perfect example of that. I had made a decision to be more aware of my internal dialogue, and here was my first opportunity to act on it. I thought through it all again. Andrew's coming to hang out with my kids. I hardly know him. It would be good to meet with him first. I should organize to do that. Nothing else. No other intentions, no hidden agenda. That was that. Instead of letting those internal voices dictate what I did, I sent him a text and asked if he wanted to meet for a drink to chat before Thursday. I wasn't a drinker, but couldn't think of any other place that would be open at night. Andrew was happy to catch up at the Aldgate pub, and we chatted for hours. The conversation was so easy. Andrew had many things to say and so many things he believed in. Social justice was obviously a big topic for him, which I liked. Sadly, there were now so many beige people in my life, and Andrew was far from beige, and he seemed like a breath of fresh air. As they started to close up the pub, I said I just had one more thing to ask him. I apologized, but as a mother, I had to ask, was there any reason I shouldn't feel safe about letting him into my family to spend time with my kids? It wasn't easy to ask, but I felt like I had to. Andrew took a couple of moments before he answered. He explained that there was something and told me his story. Andrew was completely honest with me, and that mattered more to me in that moment than what he was actually telling me about. I was grateful that he was able to confide in me, and I told him that I trusted him with my children. I could almost see him exhaling. It felt wrong to end the evening after such a vulnerable story, so I explained that he was welcome to come over if he wanted to. I reminded him that my sister was there, just to clarify that I wasn't suggesting anything else besides a friendly cup of tea. The three of us ended up talking till 4 a.m. The conversation flowed really easily. And at one point, I thought that maybe Abigail and Andrew could end up being a couple. They would look so cute together, Andrew with his long hair and beard, and Abigail with her knitted beanie. A few days later, Andrew showed up at our house on his bike for a nature walk. I had promised the kids that I would come along until they got to know Andrew for themselves. We walked down to the Bridgewater playground. It's a beautiful space full of trees with a creek running through a tunnel that the kids love to explore. I sat down at a picnic table and watched my kids and Andrew hopping across the creek using different rocks to stand on so they wouldn't get wet. Each jumped further than the last. The sun was shining through the treetops, reflecting on the water bubbling around them. That very moment, I had a very clear, yet very bizarre moment of knowing that this was now our new family. Just like that. I hadn't heard a voice as such, just this very clear and still knowing. This was us now. We are a family. I tried to shake the feeling off and dismissing it as my overactive imagination, but it remained. This is us, and this is our new family. I tried not to stare at Andrew as we started walking back to the house. It was an incredibly strange feeling, so different from when we had walked the same path only a short time ago. I turned around and noticed a dog walking behind us. He followed us the whole way home. He seemed to think we were a family as well, hoping he could be adopted in too. I tried to rationalize things over the next few days. I told myself that Andrew was just there for the kids, but no matter how much I tried, I knew it was more than that. He was now part of our family. I didn't even feel as if I had a choice in the matter. I just had to accept it. Less than a week later, I received a text from Andrew asking me what I was up to. I told him I was just waiting for the kids to fall asleep, and then I was going to go have some thinking time on my beloved trampoline. He could join me if he wanted. Only a few minutes later, I got a text from him. He was waiting for me on the trampoline. In that moment, I knew that he was not just interested in helping out with my kids. He was interested in me. I walked to the trampoline in the dark, knowing that my life was just about to change. We lay there under the stars talking. I was trying my hardest to not roll into him, but two bodies on a trampoline tend to lean into each other. A lot of effort went into staying as neutral looking as possible. We had a lot to talk about. Where did we begin? I suggested we begin with A and work our way through the alphabet, each of us asking the other each of us asking the other questions starting with each letter. When we got to C, Andrew asked, "Children, do you want more of them?" Yes, I did. I explained how I spent half a year coming to terms with the fact that I wouldn't have any more. But yes, in my heart, I wanted more kids. I knew it deep within me. We stayed out we stayed out there for hours talking. In fact, we stayed awake until the birds started singing, and I quickly jumped up and explained that I had to go. Like Cinderella hearing the midnight bells ring, I was gone in a flash. I needed to be a mom, and I needed to be inside when the kids woke up. A week later, I turned 30. Instead of the decade of abstinence ceremony I had planned, we went camping in amongst the sand dunes on the York Peninsula. Me, the kids, Abigail, and of course Andrew. When I was 30 years and a day old, Andrew kissed me for the first time in a tent with the ocean roaring in the distance. I marveled at how we now had this new person in our family, and I couldn't really even say that I had wanted it. I just needed to accept it. Andrew poured himself into his new role as dad. He spent every free moment at our place, teaching the kids how to ride bikes, telling them about space and his travels through India. Tikva started to call him Dad straight away. She loved having a father that so clearly adored her. All this time that Andrew was with the kids meant that I had the space to get my assignments done for college. Andrew could hang out and create adventures while I could lock myself in the front of the computer and study. It wasn't long before Andrew didn't even bother going home at night. The kids were asking him to read bedtime stories and asking for him at breakfast. It seemed crazy for Andrew to be anywhere else. We started telling friends that we were a couple. I like to add, I live in the Baptist manse and he lives in the Anglican manse, and now we have a romance. I thought it was so funny. I couldn't say it for very long because Andrew officially moved in with us not long after. There was no need for us to have two houses anymore. I notified the real estate agent about an extra tenant so it could be on the official records. They didn't mind an extra adult. However, the church did. Initially, they tried to make it out that they were just concerned about my general welfare. I had a visit from the pastor and one of the elders of the church. They told me that they were visiting me because of concerns for my well-being and for the children. I thanked them and told them not to worry, we were fine. Was this about the house? No, of course not. This was not about the house. I explained that I had an arrangement through the real estate agency and that I had notified them about the extra tenant. No, this wasn't about the house at all, just about my well-being. I thanked them, but a week later I got called into a meeting at the church with all the elders present. They all knew me and I knew all of them. I also knew that every single one of them in that room had skeletons in their closet. I knew which of them had children out of wedlock and whose children were sleeping around with who outside of marriage. Not one person in that room had a clear record, so to speak. Yet none of them spoke out when I was told that I was living in sin. I reminded them that they might not agree with my choices, but I had an agreement through the real estate agency, and I had been told that the church was not to get involved. I knew that I was originally set up to protect them from to protect them from me and not paying rent. What I didn't know was that it meant that the church would completely disregard the arrangement if it suited them. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail from the real estate agent saying I needed to be out of the house in 90 days. No explanation was given. We had already decided to drive to Melbourne over Christmas so that Andrew could introduce me to his family. House hunting would have to wait. It's an 8-hour drive between Adelaide and Melbourne if you don't stop too often. Thankfully, Andrew was happy to do all the driving. When we arrived, his family made us feel very welcome. They lived in a huge house, so we had 2 bedrooms to ourselves. It was really special to get some time with Louise, Andrew's mom. I knew that she had battled cancer for a while and that anything social was an effort for her. She did her best to spend time with us in the living room, though, and only retreated to her bed as the exhaustion became too much. Often she would just sit on the couch with blankets over her legs, watching the rest of us having fun. We didn't get much of a chance to talk, but she made sure to let me know how special it was for her to see her son so happy. She had been praying for her son to have a wife and kids and didn't think she would live to see the day. Her prayers had been answered through this instant family, and nothing could make her happier. I smiled. It felt good to give this woman such a precious gift. Andrew was a natural dad, and I loved that his mom was able to see that for herself. It felt clumsy to celebrate Christmas when it really felt as if Louise wasn't going to live much longer. Since leaving Sweden as a child, I had never really done much for Christmas, and I always made sure I did something to mark the event. I loved to create some sort of cozy feel for the occasion. When I realized that Andrew's family were going to eat their Christmas meal under bright fluorescent lights and it was going to look like just like any other dinner, I popped out to the shops to buy a couple of candles. A tea towel became a mini tablecloth, and with the gingerbread kits I had brought along for Asher and Tikva, I was able to create a bit of a Christmas feel. It was so little, but Andrew's dad was impressed by what a difference a candle could make. Our conversation turned more intimate, and we started talking about fears that we had. I explained that I had always had nightmares about empty swimming pools and giant waves slowly creeping in from the horizon and engulfing the ground I was standing on. In fact, I had a dream about it the night before, standing on a cliff and realizing that the wave in the distance was getting bigger and bigger and that the cliff wasn't going to be high enough. We started talking about tsunamis and what they actually are. None of us were exactly sure, so Andrew's dad went and brought the encyclopedia from the other room and read out what tsunamis are. The next day, the book was still on the table next to the burnt-out candles. The tsunami page still open when the news started to come in. The Boxing Day tsunami in the Indian Ocean had already killed so many people. The numbers climbed by the hour. All I could think about were the kids back in the orphanage in Sri Lanka. Were they safe? I hadn't kept in touch with them once I had left. I hadn't needed to. Danya had returned to Jerusalem, and our church was so taken in by the plight of these poor children. Donations were made, and after that, a group of young people flew over to Sri Lanka on a regular basis with school supplies and other items that were needed. I spent the next week glued to the newspaper, reading as much as I could. Eventually, the news I had been dreading came in. The whole town we visited on the east coast of Sri Lanka had been wiped out by the tsunami. Thousands were still missing. Andrew struggled with my need to read the newspaper. He didn't understand why I was spending so much time leeching off other people's pain. We had gone camping with some of the friends he had grown up with, and he was frustrated at me reading the paper. I tried to explain to him that it was something that I liked to do. When things happen around the world, I usually had a friend who lived there or was from there, and it made it a lot more real if I could read about it. It seemed to bother Andrew. Actually, lots of things seemed to bother Andrew. Now that we were hanging out with his friends, I noticed how many things Andrew had a strong opinion about. It was getting somewhat tedious to hear his constant negativity. He seemed to be angry at so many things. I had already noticed how he didn't like being corrected either, especially by women. There were many great things about him, but it was getting harder to ignore the bristles. A few weeks after we returned from our trip to Melbourne, I went for a walk with my sister Abigail. She was really struggling with having Andrew in the house, and I thought it would be good to go for a walk once the kids were asleep. I didn't get a chance to spend much time with her alone, so a walk would be perfect. After we'd been walking for a while, Abigail said she wanted to talk to me about something. She didn't want to upset me. I braced myself. I knew what was coming. She told me that she didn't feel right about Andrew and that there was something about him she didn't like. I remained silent. She went on to say that there was a darkness about him that made her feel uneasy. I knew exactly what she was talking about. I felt it too. I just couldn't admit it to myself. It was too scary to acknowledge. It was too scary because I just found out I was pregnant. I knew Abigail was right, though. I had aligned myself yet again with a man who had a dark side that still had power over him. I couldn't exactly put my finger on it, but deep down I knew it. This man, who was so wonderful to my kids, who had vowed to look after me and my 2 children, and who was now paying the rent and buying our food to show how committed he was to be a dad and partner. This troubled yet generous man who had now fathered my 3rd child. I kept my pregnancy quiet for as long as possible. It felt too confronting. We eventually found a house to move to, and Abigail decided that she wanted to go back to the States to live. She couldn't share a house with Andrew anymore. I was sad to see her go, but also relieved. In many ways, having Abigail there triggered the stuff in Andrew that I struggled with. He so clearly didn't like her. Without my sister on the scene, there was one less thing to provoke him and his outbursts. I needed as much harmony around me as possible. This pregnancy had completely drained me of my energy. My first 2 pregnancies made me really tired, but this was something else. I was totally and utterly exhausted. It was hard to keep my eyes open after 7 o'clock. All I wanted to do was crawl into a hole and hide away. I knew my kids would be okay, though. Andrew was there to look after them. For the first time as a mother, I could switch off and someone would be there to take over. I had never experienced that with Paul. Andrew was the complete opposite. He was constantly proving himself to be an incredible dad despite his short time in his new role. Not only was he constantly coming up with new ideas for the kids to do, he was also spending more time in the kitchen wanting to cook. His 30th birthday was approaching, and we had organized an Indian-themed birthday party for him. Because I was planning a home birth, we hired a small local hall to celebrate his birthday, so that we could keep the birthing pool set up in the kitchen if needed. Andrew's birthday was only 2 days after mine, and our baby was due the day in between. I assumed the baby would arrive late, like my first two, so I figured we could risk having a party on the due date. Andrew's parents and sister were going to drive over for the party and hopefully be around to see their first official grandchild. The party was a great success, but there was only one thing on Andrew's mind: our baby. He was desperate for the baby to be born. He had already arranged to take a few weeks off from work once the baby arrived, but the agony of waiting was getting too much for him, and he decided to stop work in anticipation. I was grateful because I was an absolutely giant by now. This baby was huge, and my body was bigger than ever. I knew that if I was giving birth in a hospital, they would be telling me that I needed to be induced straight away. We had decided on a home birth so that the hospital couldn't dictate what would happen. I was convinced that the reason my previous births had been so painful was because I hadn't gone into labor naturally. Being induced meant that my body didn't have the slow buildup and that it needed to prepare for the upcoming birth. Instead, it had been hit by contractions out of nowhere and went into shock. This time would be different. The only problem was that the baby was showing no signs of wanting to come out. Neither of us were too concerned. We felt this baby would arrive when it was ready. However, others didn't share those feelings. Andrew's parents were concerned because they had a niece who was stillborn. I had friends calling me, telling me that I was putting my baby in danger. I asked our midwife to come over daily and check the baby. She listened to the heartbeat and made sure my blood pressure was all right. There was no need to panic. When it was 21 days after my due date, we went into the hospital to have an ultrasound to check that everything was all right with our baby. The doctors were horrified at how overdue I was and told me that this baby had to be born. Yes, everything was technically fine, but the amniotic fluid was low and the baby couldn't stay in any longer. If this baby wasn't born within 24 hours, I had to return to the hospital for an induction. They did a quick measure and told me that the baby was too big for natural delivery, especially the baby's belly. I wasn't sure if I should believe them. The doctors had said the same thing about Asher, telling me that he was a giant and he turned out to be only 3.6 kilos. They had been saying he was at least 4.5 kilos. Either way, I decided to try anything I could to help this baby out. I drank 3 lots of castor oil that night, and Andrew cooked me the spiciest curry he could come up with. We had sex more times in 24 hours than I thought was possible, but nothing helped. Eventually, my midwife suggested that she rupture the membrane. The water breaking would activate the birth. I reluctantly agreed. I'd hoped to avoid intervention, but it was better than going into hospital. In fact, anything was better than going into hospital. Once the membranes ruptured, I started to walk up and down the steep streets around our house. When I came back to our house for a rest, I had 3 midwives massaging me, hoping to trigger reflexology points, and incense was burnt that was meant to stimulate the birthing process. I was in awe of the care and nurturing that these devoted midwives were giving me. Finally, after 24 hours of getting the labor started, I could feel cramping deep down inside me. Over the next few hours, the cramping increased, and I eventually asked Andrew and the midwives to fill up the birthing pool in our kitchen. The water felt so good, and I stayed in as long as I could. I was moaning because of the unbearable pain, but I was so grateful to at least be at home in pain instead of in a sterile hospital with strangers. I had gotten to know my 2 midwives really well. Tanya was the support midwife, and she was spending just as much time helping us as our main midwife. A 3rd midwife had been asked to come along as well. I knew Lisa from a monthly home birth group that I had started going to. She was Welsh, so I really didn't understand much of what she said, but I really liked her, and I could tell that she had lots of experience. She was working at the fanciest private hospital in Adelaide, but was hoping to start working independently as soon as she could afford it. Lisa was so horrified at what she saw happen in the private hospital. Women having C-sections for no reason at all. Doctors making women feel as if their labors were taking too long, only so they could clock off at a decent time. Women being bullied out of natural births for the convenience of the medical staff. Lisa was so fed up with being part of the system and longed to get out. I was happy to have her with us, even though she was only there for extra support because of how overdue I was. I knew that we were in safe hands. The birth was taking a long time and I was screaming out in pain. I could hear my midwife tell Andrew that I was in transition. He would soon be holding his baby. I kept screaming, my eyes now rolling back in my head. I was expecting to feel the baby between my legs at any moment. I finally put my hand down there to touch the scalp, only to realize that I wasn't even open. I had been screaming for 5 hours until my lungs emptied. This was torture, absolute torture. After all those hours, I got pulled out of the pool because I needed some gravity to help this baby descend. Somehow, I managed to get to my bed, and our mattress was thankfully on the floor. The screaming was so loud that I knew that all our neighbors would be hearing me as they tried to sleep. There was nothing I could do to control it. The pain was worse than anything I had ever experienced before. And just when I thought that it couldn't get any worse, it did. Eventually, the pushing stage started. Nothing I had heard about prepared me for this experience. A force was surging through my body, yet the baby was not moving. When it did move down a tiny bit, it would immediately slide up again. My 3 midwives were directing me in what to do. Push, breathe, pant, 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 push. I tried to follow what they said, but the baby was stuck, really stuck. The damn doctors were right. This was a huge baby, and the angle of my pelvis was making it pretty much impossible for this baby to be born. My midwife was out of her depth, and thankfully Lisa was there to take over. She knew exactly what to do. 2 sets of hands were now inside me, and the baby's shoulder was hooked out. The pain was excruciating, but I could feel progress being made. The baby was slowly coming. Andrew kept calling out what he could see. I felt as if I was going to split in half when the tummy was passing through me. Finally, the baby was out, and there was total silence in the room. The midwives were rubbing the baby's chest, and I started blowing on the face, willing this baby to land and to take the first breath. It felt like such a long time. Thankfully, there was no panic. After a bit of a splutter, we could hear a cry. This giant, bruised baby had finally arrived. We had a girl. I collapsed on the bed, allowing the after pains to shoot through me, relieved that it was over, but in total disbelief that I had survived. Andrew held his long-awaited baby girl. He was totally smitten. His face melted as he looked at the bundle in his arms. We had already decided on a name, both of us agreeing that it was the perfect choice. When I was growing up, I used to sing the song Summertime with my family, and then I would sing it to my children as they fell asleep. It had become special to Andrew as well, and considering his mother had longed to spend another summer with her family, we felt it was perfect to name our baby girl Summer. The next few days, Andrew floated around. He was in total awe of his baby girl. As her swelling subsided, we realized that Summer had the most giant blue eyes that looked bigger each day. She had been so bruised when coming out that it was only a couple of weeks later that we could really see what she looked like. I had my own healing to do as well. The birth in itself had been so excruciating, but now I had hemorrhoids to deal with too. It felt as if shards of glass were poking into me. Nothing helped. I tried everything. Ointments, painkillers, rubber gloves filled with water and then frozen and stuck into my bottom. I tried anything that was recommended for relief, but nothing worked. Those first couple of weeks were so incredibly painful. Summer weighed 4.6 kilos, and it was obviously too much for my body to handle. Amazingly, Andrew's family drove across to Adelaide again to meet with their new granddaughter. Louise desperately wanting to hold Summer. 2 long trips in a month was a big sacrifice for Louise. We spent most of their visit just enjoying each other's company, Louise too exhausted to give Summer a bath, but happy to watch. It was only a brief visit, but Louise asked if she could take me out for lunch one day. She wanted some time alone with me. I was touched at her gesture, and I drove us to Hahndorf and asked Louise to choose a place to eat. As we shared a salad, Louise told me how grateful she was for me. She wanted me to know that she admired my mothering and my patience with my children. She repeated what she had told me a year earlier about how she had almost given up hope that she would ever see Andrew have a family. He had caused him so much hardship when he was younger by mistreating his sister throughout her childhood. Louise had tried to imagine what sort of woman he would end up with and had prayed that he could find someone strong enough to handle him. I tried to smile and to show her that her prayers had been answered. She was dying of cancer. She deserved to think that her son was finally a good man. I wanted to cry, though, and to tell her the truth. I wasn't strong. Well, I wasn't strong enough. I had survived a lot in life, but Andrew was wearing me down. His negativity and constant criticism was too much for me to handle. I couldn't tell her that. Even though I looked strong, I was really weak. I smiled and said that Andrew was a great dad. That was truthful. She went on to say that seeing Andrew be a good husband was so important to her. She knew we hadn't had a wedding, but she wanted me to know that she saw us as married. I wasn't sure why she started talking about a family friend, her husband's mate, and how he had cheated on his wife. Louise told me how disgusted she was and that she didn't like her husband spending time with his friend. It still made her feel uncomfortable all these years later. She went on to say that she knew that Andrew was difficult to live with, but at least he was faithful. I agreed. I knew he was. We had to return back to the house. I could see that Louise was fading. For a quiet woman, she had done a lot of talking. It was obvious that she had wanted me to know these things, and they were close to her heart. Only a few months later, Louise passed away. Andrew had arrived in Melbourne a week earlier to help out. I drove across with the kids and got there just in time. She died the morning after we arrived. I had spent the evening massaging her hands and feet, telling her that she was loved. I had brought a candle to light, but was surprised to see that Andrew's dad had already lit one in the room. Louise had been battling cancer for such a long time, but it was still a shock that she was gone. Andrew loved his mom and grieved deeply. Thankfully, he had 2 kids who adored him and a gorgeous baby girl who loved being with her dad, as well as another baby already on the way. Before his mother had died, Andrew was able to tell her that he was going to be a dad again, a father of 4. Our friends did their best to hide their shock at another pregnancy so soon. They shouldn't have been surprised, though. Nothing about us was really conventional. We had already pulled Asher and Tikva out of school. Tikva was struggling so much with feeling restricted in her creativity. She had daily tummy aches and more tantrums and pleading not to go to school. Academically, she was soaring ahead in her class. Her work was perfect and her spelling and reading ahead of her years. She just couldn't cope with being stuck in an institution. I pulled her out for a term, but very quickly realized that she was much happier outside of school. Asher soon followed. Their dad, Paul, was seeing his kids more often now, and even he agreed that they seemed happier and more at ease. It was nice that he noticed. There was a lot of friction between me and Andrew. I couldn't even pinpoint exactly what it was about. It just seemed like we both misunderstood each other all the time. Something that I said neutrally was taken as an attack. I was told that I was screaming at Andrew even when I hadn't even raised my voice. I felt that Andrew was becoming more and more critical with the kids, especially Asher. He seemed to take out his frustrations on me by giving Asher a hard time. The one moment in our week that we all seemed to set our differences aside was our Friday nights at Central Markets in Chinatown. I was thrilled when I realized that Andrew had the same weekly ritual as us. We had never seen him there since he usually arrived after we had to back up the hills for the night, but now as a family we could go together. Andrew's friends from church would often go as well, so it was a great way to end the week. We would arrive early and just enjoy bumping into different people. Often we would grab a table and sit for hours as the kids played on the rails outside the public toilets. Things were not improving with me and Andrew, but there wasn't really much I could do about it. I wanted things to work out between us. I really did. I knew he wanted the same. We just didn't seem to be able to find any common ground. I was wanting us to talk about our marriage. Andrew seemed to want to talk about politics. He had recently started reading political books and was becoming more and more passionate about things going on in Israel and Palestine. He seemed offended at me not wanting to get into it. Me saying that things were so complex and that it was impossible for him to have a valid opinion until he had spent some time there. The Middle East conflict was the last thing our marriage needed right now. The birth of my 4th baby was around the corner, and I felt the best thing I could do to prepare was to make sure I didn't gain too much weight. According to my midwife, the reason my last birth was so hard was because Summer was such a big baby. If I could try and keep my weight lower, there was more of a chance to have a smaller baby. We had decided to ask Lisa to be our midwife. She had stood out during Summer's birth as the obvious choice. In many ways, I felt that Summer was only alive, or at least not brain damaged, because of Lisa's incredible skill during a very difficult birth. She was thrilled to be asked. I still struggled to understand her Welsh accent, but I loved her wonderful mix of warmth and expertise. I knew that my babies didn't want to come out no matter how long I waited. This time I could help things along on the due date so as to not risk a Christmas baby. Thankfully, it didn't take nearly as long to get things going. I tried to go for a walk, like I had in anticipation for Summer's birth, but my legs wouldn't hold me up. Once again, this birth was very different to my previous ones, and I tried just to go with the waves of pain that were starting to roll in. Lisa was at another birth, so she had asked her friend, who was a midwife, to sit with me until she could join us later. I was in awe at how committed Lisa was to her birthing women. I knew how much she gave each birth, so to come straight to me after being at a birth was a beautiful gift. She could have easily told me that she needed some time to rest in between, but instead she came straight over to replace the stand-in midwife. The moment Lisa arrived, my contractions started to kick in properly, almost as if my body had waited for her to arrive. This birth was incredibly hard and difficult as well, but not nearly as traumatic as the one 12 months earlier. I could feel the baby making progress, and after a lot of pushing and me hanging on to Andrew, I pushed another little girl out. She was adorable. She had this tiny little nose that pointed up. It was just as if a little forest creature had crawled into my arms, her eyes dark brown like her older brother. I knew she would be my last child, and I took the opportunity to cut the umbilical cord for the first time. I was so thrilled to have this gorgeous little being join our family. I held her close and inhaled her as deeply as I could. I was totally smitten. Andrew cradled her as I showered, and just as I was about to hold her again, I started to get the shakes, just like I had with each of my girls. But this time the shaking wouldn't stop, though, even as warm blankets were placed around me. My teeth were chattering, and nothing could warm me up. I eventually vomited and fell forwards on my bed. Once I came to, Lisa and Andrew asked me if I was all right. They told me that I'd been asleep for about 10 minutes. Asleep? Why would I have been asleep? Andrew asked me if I wanted to hold the baby. Baby? What baby? Andrew looked at me strangely. Our baby. Do you want to hold her? A baby? I've had a baby? What baby? I had a baby? My mind was trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I could remember giving birth, and I could remember cutting the cord, but a baby? My mind was spinning. I didn't have a baby. How could he be saying that? I wanted to scream. I felt as if I was trapped in a nightmare. I tried to reach for some water, but my hand wouldn't move. I was watching it lie still as I tried to make it obey my command. I wanted to say something to Lisa, but other words were coming out of my mouth. I could hear myself saying things that didn't match with the words I was forming in my head. It was now getting harder to breathe, my lungs hurting for air. I wanted to ask for oxygen, but I couldn't form a proper sentence, so I just said, oxygen. Oxygen. Lisa had been checking me over to see if there was anything wrong. No hemorrhaging, my pulse was fine, nothing seemed out of sorts except my very bizarre behavior. I could feel something pulling me away. It was as if I was starting to leave my body. I realized I was dying. It hit me that this is how mothers die in childbirth. It didn't have to be during the screaming and agony of the actual birth. They die after as well from complications. I was going to be one of those unfortunate women. I tried to pull myself back into my body, asking again for oxygen. I was going to die. My children would no longer have a mother. I knew my girls would be okay, but what about Asher? He was so attached to me. What would happen to him? I had to live. I had to stay. I could see Lisa and Andrew giving each other looks. They didn't seem that concerned, though. There was nothing dramatic going on as such, just me behaving strangely and trying not to use up my last bit of strength in saying words that didn't quite come out right. Eventually, Lisa handed the oxygen to me. There was no mask for my face, so it was just a tube. I tried to put it into my nose, but my hand still wasn't cooperating. I was moving the tube in slow motion over my face, Andrew smiling at how silly I looked. After a while, they decided it was best if an ambulance was called. I was still acting so strangely, my eyes rolling around. Once the paramedics arrived, I was strapped into a stretcher and wheeled out of our house. I looked up at the ceiling, and it felt as if the walls and corners were dancing for me, moving in and out to a silent song. The trees outside our house bowing down as I rolled into the ambulance. An oxygen mask was placed over my face, and I could finally inhale properly, my lungs opening up. My mind started to clear. We were only partially down the freeway when I could speak properly again. I let the paramedic sitting next to me know that I was fine. Once I arrived at the hospital, I was treated so gently by the nurses. I thought they might be upset with me for having a home birth. If they were, they didn't show it. Each one of them asked me if I was okay and if I needed anything. Did I want to hold my baby? That's right, I had a baby, a little girl. I remembered her tiny little nose, like a little squirrel. When Andrew walked in the room, I reached out to hold my daughter, Sage, my last child, who would become one of my greatest teachers. She was even cuter than I remembered her. Sage Louise. I had my fourth baby. I could finally stop and let my body heal.